It is often said that the most terrifying stories do not begin with monsters in the shadows, but with the illusion of safety. A school bus, a group of children, a trusted journey into the ordinary. Field trips are meant to be a day of laughter, of packed lunches, of whispered secrets between friends as the wheels carry them away from the routine of classrooms. Yet, beneath the cheerful yellow paint of those buses, beneath the tired smiles of teachers trying to keep order, history holds reminders that not every trip ends with children returning home. Some end with silence, with unanswered questions, and with stories that never should have been told. The field trip in question began like so many others. The bus, rusted at the edges but still reliable enough to convince parents their children would be safe, rolled forward under the pale morning sun. No one knew that by nightfall the laughter inside that bus would be replaced by something else, something darker. Survivors described it not as a sudden tragedy, but as a slow unraveling of normality, like the world itself had turned against them. They would later say the air had shifted, the sky had grown heavier, and that they felt watched before anything truly happened. But how can one measure dread before the first scream breaks the silence? There is a line that haunts anyone who dares to revisit this story. We left together, but we did not all come back. It is a line that has been whispered in town meetings, etched into diaries, repeated in hushed tones by those who want to forget, and by those who refuse to let the truth die. It is the heartbeat of a mystery that continues to bleed into the present. For in the middle of an ordinary field trip, something occurred that cannot be explained with logic alone, something that left investigators baffled, families broken, and an entire community afraid of sending children beyond their doorsteps. What is most unsettling is not the event itself, but the fragments left behind. A bus that seemed normal yet carried an unshakable darkness. Teachers whose stories conflicted with one another, as if memories had been torn apart and rearranged. Students who swore they saw things outside the windows, shapes in the trees, faces in the fog that others denied. A driver who would later be described as calm, too calm, as if he knew what was coming. Consider this. School buses have carried millions of children for decades, across towns and highways, through rain and heat, over bridges and into the heart of cities. Yet, how many of those journeys have ended without record, without anyone noticing the danger that brushed so close? We rarely question it because the bus is familiar. The bus is safe, but what happens when the familiar turns hostile? When the safe becomes a trap? When the sound of tires on asphalt becomes the last thing some will ever hear? This story is not about legends. It is not about ghosts whispered around campfires or invented tales told to frighten children. It is about something recorded, remembered, and feared by those who lived through it. It is about what happens when a routine school day fractures into horror, and it begins with a bus that left the schoolyard and did not return in the way anyone expected. You may already feel a chill at the thought of it. That sense of stepping into something you cannot walk back from. The truth is this: the field trip in question has become a scar, a moment frozen in time, still debated by investigators, still dissected by families, still heavy in the minds of the few who dare to remember. The tragedy did not just take lives. It took certainty. It proved that even the most ordinary day can bend into nightmare. Ask yourself, what if you had been there? Sitting in one of those cracked seats, your backpack tucked against your knees, listening to the chatter of friends as the bus rumbled down a lonely road. At what moment would you have realized something was wrong? Would you have noticed the silence outside? The way the trees leaned closer, the way the driver never once glanced into the rearview mirror? Or would it have been too late before you understood? There are questions that will never be answered, questions buried with those who did not come back. But the chilling truth is that the survivors carry more than memories. They carry fragments of something that feels less than human, something that slipped into their lives when they least expected it. To this day, the story remains not just a tale of tragedy, but of fear that still walks among the living. What began as a field trip ended as a warning. A reminder that horror does not wait in distant places or dark corners of the imagination. It can ride beside you, hidden in the hum of an engine, in the rhythm of a bus rolling down an empty road. It can appear when you least expect it, when the sun is shining, when the laughter is loudest, when you believe you are safe. And so the story begins with a question. If you were told that a simple bus ride could change everything you believed about safety, about trust, about reality itself, would you still climb aboard? The story of the field trip does not exist in isolation. To understand its weight, one must first understand the world it grew from. It was not just another bus ride gone wrong. It was the unraveling of a community's faith in itself, a fracture in a small town that already carried quiet shadows. The town was like so many others, quiet, unremarkable, stitched together by routines and rituals. The school stood at the edge of a wide field, its bricks weathered by years of storms, its hallways echoing with the same sounds every morning, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, the low murmur of teachers calling children to attention. Parents trusted the school not only with education, but with the unspoken promise of safety. They sent their children through those doors with the belief that they would come back carrying nothing heavier than homework. That trust had been built over decades, layered with memories of sports games, holiday concerts, and assemblies where the flag was raised under the same sky that watched over every ordinary morning. But beneath that normality lay stories older than the children could know. The land on which the school stood had once been farmland, then forest before that. And before settlers ever arrived, it had been a place spoken of in tones of respect and unease. The ground carried more than roots. It carried memory. It carried warnings that had been silenced when the town sought progress over caution. The bus itself was not new. It had been in service for years, its yellow paint dulled and chipped, its seats patched with tape where fabric had split. To most, it was just another vehicle, worn but dependable. But to the children who rode it every day, it was more than transportation. It was a world of its own. Conversation sparked and died in its narrow aisles. Secrets were whispered, insults traded, friendships forged in the time it took to reach school and back again. No one thought the bus could hold anything but ordinary memories, and yet there are places and objects that absorb more than we realize, that collect fragments of every journey, every voice, until something begins to change. Some say the bus was already heavy with things that could not be seen. On the morning of the field trip, the atmosphere was deceptively bright. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of day that seemed designed for a school outing. Children carried lunches packed with care, their chatter filling the air as they lined up to board. Teachers checked lists, counted heads, repeated instructions that blurred into background noise. For the adults, the trip was routine. For the students, it was a break from the monotony of classrooms and textbooks. No one suspected that this trip would become something whispered about for years. The destination was unremarkable, just another place chosen for its educational value, a place where history could be taught outside the classroom walls. Yet it is not the destination that matters in this story. It is the road between, the stretches of time where the bus carried its passengers into silence and then into fear. Survivors later spoke of a sense of dislocation, as if the familiar roads they knew had become different, wrong in small but undeniable ways. Trees appeared where none should have been. Paths curved where they had once run straight. The very geography of their world seemed to shift, and yet no one could explain how. This sense of unease did not arrive without warning. Some of the children remembered teachers exchanging uneasy glances, as though something felt off even before the bus left the schoolyard. The driver, too, had seemed distracted, his gaze fixed too firmly ahead, his responses clipped and delayed. In hindsight, parents recalled details they had dismissed at the time. The way the bus had idled longer than usual before departure, the way the air smelled faintly metallic, the way a few children complained of headaches before they ever left town. These fragments, meaningless on their own, later became part of a larger pattern that none could ignore. The community itself was not prepared for the weight of what would come. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives. Farmers, shopkeepers, workers who measured their days by sunrises and dinners around the same tables. When the tragedy struck, it was not just the children who were lost or broken. It was the entire rhythm of the town. Parents who once stood at bus stops with easy smiles now looked at every school vehicle with suspicion. Teachers who once trusted in the stability of field trips now carried doubt in their voices when signing permission slips. The entire structure of trust collapsed. To understand why this story still echoes, one must recognize how fragile that trust always was. Safety is not guaranteed. It is a story we tell ourselves to make the days bearable. The school, the bus, the routine of children laughing on the way to a destination. It was all part of that story. When it shattered, it revealed how thin the walls between the ordinary and the unexplainable truly are. The context of this field trip is not just about where they went, but about the faith the community placed in a system that promised protection. When that promise broke, nothing could repair it. The tragedy is remembered not only for the horror of what happened, but for the weight it carried afterward. Families who once gathered for community events began to withdraw. Children who once ran freely through streets stayed inside. The school, once the heart of the town, became a place of whispers, a reminder of what had been lost. And the bus, its shadow remained long after it was retired, a relic that people swore carried more than rust and wear. Some say it was more than metal that groaned when its wheels turned. Some say it carried a history that should have been buried. Every story has a beginning, but the roots of this one are deep. It began with a town, a school, a bus, and the fragile belief that children could be carried safely away and safely back again. That belief was destroyed, and in its place grew a silence that still lingers. The first hours of the field trip seemed ordinary. Children filled the bus with restless chatter, trading snacks, whispering about the destination, laughing at private jokes that only made sense in the tight world of youth. Teachers, seated near the front, tried to maintain order while keeping their own exhaustion hidden. The driver focused on the road with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, his eyes fixed too intently on the horizon. No one imagined that within those hours the line between the expected and the unexplainable would begin to blur. It started with something so small that at first it felt irrelevant. Survivors later recalled how the morning light seemed to fade faster than it should have, how the day felt older than the clock suggested. Shadows deepened along the roadside, stretching across the asphalt as though the sun had weakened. Some children joked that it looked like evening, but the teachers dismissed it as nothing more than the tricks of a cloudy sky. Yet the clouds never formed. The air grew heavy, humid, and strange, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened, slowing their breaths. The bus took familiar routes, roads well traveled by parents and locals alike. Yet more than one passenger whispered that the scenery looked different. Landmarks that should have been visible were gone. A gas station that always marked the edge of town did not appear. A billboard that many of the children recognized, covered with faded paint, was simply absent. At first, they believed the driver had taken an alternate route, but when asked, he gave no clear answer. He only muttered something about construction, his voice low and difficult to hear over the rumble of the engine. Then came the silence. It was not immediate, but gradual. Laughter died down, replaced with murmurs, then with quiet. The children stared out the windows, unsettled by the growing sameness of the landscape. Trees appeared denser, pressing closer to the road. Their branches knotted together as though they sought to block the bus's path. The asphalt narrowed until it seemed barely wide enough to contain the vehicle. The teachers tried to distract the students with conversation, but even they fell into uneasy quiet. The driver never turned to reassure them. His hands tightened on the wheel, the muscles in his arms tense and rigid. Stranger still was the sense that the road itself had become longer. What should have been a short trip began to stretch into hours. Watches confirmed the passage of time, yet the scenery did not change in ways it should have. Familiar landmarks never appeared, and instead the same stretches of trees, the same bends in the road seemed to repeat themselves. Survivors later described the sensation of being trapped in a loop, as though the bus was moving but not arriving anywhere. Some swore they saw the same twisted tree 3, 4, even 5 times, though no one could agree on how many repetitions there had been. The first real break in the illusion came when the bus slowed. There was no reason for it, no stoplight, no obstruction, no sign of construction. The driver pressed the brake and the vehicle crawled forward at a pace that made the children restless and afraid. The teachers questioned him, but he did not respond. His face remained pale, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When pressed, he muttered something they could not all understand, though fragments of his words lingered. He said the road was changing. He said they had gone too far. At this point, the children began to sense what the adults would not admit. Something had gone wrong. They shifted in their seats, their voices rising in nervous tones. One girl swore she saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall and still, watching them as they passed. Another claimed the figure had moved closer each time the bus looped the road. Others saw nothing, but they felt the chill that spread through the air, a coldness unnatural for the season. The windows fogged at the edges, though the bus's temperature controls had not been touched. The more they watched, the more they realized the silence was not complete. Beneath the hum of the engine there was another sound, faint, irregular, almost like whispering. Some thought it was the wind. Others said it came from beneath the bus, as if voices were rising from the ground itself. Whatever it was, it left the passengers uneasy, unwilling to speak too loudly, as though afraid to draw attention to themselves. Hours passed, and the tension deepened. The teachers tried to keep order, but their voices betrayed cracks of fear. They could not explain the missing landmarks, the length of the trip, the driver's silence. Every question met with either no response or the same phrase, "We cannot turn back now." That line would echo later, haunting the survivors more than anything else. Why could they not turn back? What force prevented the bus from reversing, from retracing its steps to safety? It was in this state of unease that the children noticed something most disturbing. The road behind them was gone. Where there should have been asphalt stretching back, there was only forest, dense and endless. They pressed their faces to the rear windows, whispering in disbelief. The teachers at first denied it, claiming the view was obscured, but eventually they saw it too. The path home had vanished, leaving only darkness behind. From this moment, the bus was no longer simply delayed, it was lost. And more than that, it was being watched. The children felt it in the weight of the air, in the way the trees leaned toward the bus, in the flickering shapes at the corners of their vision. Every mile carried them deeper into something that could not be explained. Every moment stretched into an eternity of dread. The mystery had begun to take form, and though no one could name it yet, everyone felt it pressing closer. When the bus finally stopped, it was not at the planned destination, nor at any recognizable place. The survivors described the moment as abrupt, unnatural, as though the vehicle had been forced to a halt by something unseen. The air inside the bus was still, so quiet that even the children who had been whispering into their sleeves froze in silence. Beyond the windows stretched not the landmarks they expected, but a clearing, the ground uneven, the trees arching in patterns that felt deliberate, almost architectural. It was as though the bus had entered a place that did not exist on any map. Reports written later struggled to capture this strangeness. Investigators noted that the area described by survivors should not have been reachable by bus, not without leaving paved roads, not without tearing through forests that had stood untouched for decades. Yet tire tracks were found in patches of soil, faint but undeniable, curving into spaces where no road had ever been built. The contradictions between testimony and physical evidence began here, multiplying into a web that no one could untangle. Inside the bus, the teachers tried to keep calm. They reminded the children to stay seated, promising that help would come, that the driver knew what he was doing. But their voices shook. Survivors remember watching their teachers' hands tremble as they counted heads again and again, as though numbers could anchor them to reality. The driver remained silent. When finally asked what had happened, he said only that the road had ended. He refused to step outside, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, his stare fixed on the clearing ahead. It was in those long minutes of waiting that the details began to pile up, each one stranger than the last. Several children swore they saw movement among the trees, not animals, not shadows, but figures, too tall, too still, their bodies slightly bent as if watching. Others said they heard noises beneath the bus, as if something crawled under the metal frame, scraping softly against it. Teachers dismissed these claims, insisting fear was distorting perception, but they too admitted later that they felt something watching. Evidence collected after the fact seemed to confirm fragments of these accounts. The undercarriage of the bus bore scratches that no one could explain, long, thin marks that did not match any known tools or natural causes. Soil samples from the tires contained traces of minerals not found in that region, materials that baffled analysts and had no clear origin. Photographs taken by investigators, though grainy and incomplete, showed impressions in the ground near the bus, footprints or markings that did not resemble human or animal tracks. Their shapes were uneven, spiraled as though pressed by something that had no reason to exist. Testimony only deepened the confusion. Some children recalled seeing their teachers step outside, speaking in low voices near the bus door. Others insisted no adult ever left. Teachers claimed to remember only fragments, gaps in memory they could not explain. One admitted to hearing whispers outside, voices calling his name though no one stood in the clearing. Another said the air grew so thick he could barely breathe, that he felt as if the world itself was pressing down on his chest. None of their stories aligned perfectly, Each account contradicted another, creating a fractured picture of what occurred. Psychologists later suggested the trauma had fractured memory, that panic and stress had distorted what was real. Yet the contradictions felt heavier than simple confusion. There were details too sharp to ignore. A student remembered looking at the bus clock and seeing it had stopped, frozen at a time that did not match their watches. Another remembered the trees bending in unison, as if moved by something invisible. Teachers swore the clearing grew smaller as they waited, the tree line inching closer though no movement was visible to the eye. These claims were dismissed as hallucinations, yet they reappeared in too many accounts to be coincidence. One chilling piece of evidence stands above the rest. Among the belongings recovered from the children, a disposable camera was found. The photographs were mostly ordinary, blurred images of friends, the interior of the bus, the bright morning at the start of the trip. But the final 3 frames remain unexplained. One shows the clearing, empty except for the bus, though faint shapes can be seen in the tree line. The second shows what appears to be the interior of the bus itself, but blurred, stretched as though the walls had bent. The final image is the most unsettling. A child's face, distorted, eyes too large, mouth too wide, captured in a flash of motion that none of the survivors claimed to remember. Investigators dismissed the photos as light distortion, damage to the film, but those who have seen them in person speak of an unease that lingers long after. The official record states that the bus was found hours later by search teams, parked along a dirt road that should not have been reachable. The children were shaken but alive, their accounts confused and fragmented. Teachers refused to speak openly, their statements clipped and inconsistent. The driver vanished after the incident, his whereabouts unknown, leaving behind no explanation for his actions. This disappearance, coupled with the physical evidence that defied logic, cemented the mystery into something larger than a single day's tragedy. The contradictions only grew with time. Some survivors claimed days had passed before they were found, though records showed only hours. Parents who reunited with their children said they seemed older, as if time had stretched inside the bus. The town itself grew divided. Some believed it had been an accident, a trick of memory and fear, while others whispered that something far older and darker had touched their community. Theories formed, each one less comforting than the last. The bus was eventually retired, stored away from sight, but the questions never faded. What happened in that clearing? Why did evidence and testimony fracture so violently? And perhaps most haunting, what was it that watched from the trees, and why did it let them leave it all? The true horror of the field trip did not end when the children were found. It began afterward when they returned home carrying something invisible yet impossible to ignore. Trauma is not measured only in wounds or scars, but in silence, in the eyes of those who can no longer meet your gaze, in the voices that falter when they attempt to describe what happened. What survived that bus ride was more than fear. It was the disintegration of trust, the collapse of a community's fragile sense of safety. The children did not speak freely in the days that followed. Parents reported that many refused to sleep alone, clinging to blankets or refusing to let their bedroom lights be turned off. Some developed habits of staring out windows at night, as if waiting for something to appear. Others covered their ears when the wind passed through the trees, whispering that they could still hear voices hidden in its movement. Teachers who tried to coax them into sharing their experiences were met with blank stares, sudden tears, or stories so fractured they could not be pieced together. Nightmares became a constant. Parents told of their children waking in the early hours screaming, gasping for air, convinced they were back on the bus. Some described dreams of being pressed against the windows, watching as faces moved outside, faces too large and featureless, staring in. Others dreamed of endless roads, the bus looping endlessly, never arriving, never stopping, each turn revealing the same twisted trees. What terrified parents most was that the dreams were shared. Children who had not spoken to one another since the trip described nearly identical visions, as though the memory had seeded itself into their minds with the same shape, the same sound. The teachers were not spared. Though they tried to maintain authority, their composure fractured quickly. Colleagues noticed their absences, their trembling hands during staff meetings, their reluctance to speak about the trip at all. One teacher resigned without explanation, refusing even to say goodbye to her students. Another was found sitting in her car long after school had ended, staring at nothing, muttering that the bus was still out there. Their trauma was buried beneath professional silence, but it leaked into their every action. The driver's disappearance only sharpened the wound. For the parents, he became a symbol of unanswered questions, a figure who carried secrets they could never uncover. For the children, his absence was worse. They spoke of him not with anger, but with unease, as though he had never truly left the bus. Some claimed they saw his face reflected in mirrors, glimpsed in the corners of their homes. They would pause in the middle of conversation, their expressions empty, before whispering his name as if he were standing behind them. None of these sightings could be confirmed, but the fear in their eyes was confirmation enough. The community itself fractured under the weight of what had happened. Families grew distrustful of one another, afraid to send their children to school, afraid to ask questions that might never be answered. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed the bus had crossed into land that was cursed, others that the driver had been part of something darker, a ritual or pact no one dared name. Church meetings were filled with pleas for protection, prayers spoken louder than before, as though volume alone could drown out the silence that clung to the town. Psychologists who visited the children described symptoms consistent with trauma, yet something deeper unsettled them. The children's drawings became darker, their notebooks filled with depictions of roads that stretched into nothing, of trees with hollow eyes, of buses without doors. When asked to explain, they shrugged, claiming they had only drawn what they remembered. Some stopped speaking altogether, retreating into silence that no therapy could reach. Others became aggressive, lashing out at classmates, their tempers erupting without cause. Trauma reshaped them, stripping away innocence that no parent could restore. For the parents, guilt became a constant companion. They replayed the decision to sign permission slips, the moment they waved goodbye, the trust they placed in a school bus that should have been safe. Their grief was not for the children they lost, most had been found alive, but for the children who had returned changed, shadows of who they once were. Mothers spoke of sons who no longer laughed, of daughters who sat in silence during family meals, their eyes vacant. Fathers admitted to standing guard outside their children's doors at night, convinced something would come back for them. Even those not directly touched by the trip felt its weight. The town seemed quieter, its streets emptier, as though life itself had withdrawn. Buses that once symbolized safety became objects of suspicion. Parents drove their children themselves, unwilling to let them step onto those yellow seats again. The simple act of a bus engine rumbling down the street was enough to make some households close their curtains, as though the sound itself carried a memory that could never be erased. The psychological toll extended far beyond the children and their families. Investigators, too, reported unease. Officers assigned to the case admitted to strange dreams, of walking down roads that led nowhere, of hearing voices whisper their names when alone at night. One officer resigned after only a week on the case, claiming he had begun to see the bus parked outside his home. His neighbors confirmed no vehicle had been there. The emotional weight of the field trip was not contained to memory. It spilled into the fabric of the town, altering its rhythms, its trust, its very sense of reality. The tragedy was not only that children had suffered, but that the suffering never ended. It lingered in their homes, in their schools, in the whispered stories passed between parents who feared that one day another bus would vanish into silence. Some wounds close. This one never did. The psychological scars left by that day became a reminder that horror does not end when survivors return. It continues in the spaces between words, in the pauses before sleep, in the knowledge that the line between ordinary and unexplainable is thinner than anyone wants to admit. And in this community, that line had been broken. When the bus was finally located, the official record described it as an anomaly, but not a mystery. Investigators wrote reports heavy with words like mechanical failure, driver instability, and collective hysteria. To the outside world, these phrases seemed to offer an explanation, a way to package the horror into something rational, something manageable. But for those who lived through it, and for those who studied the case closely, the official version rang hollow. Too many details resisted explanation. Too many testimonies contradicted the idea that it was nothing more than panic on a long ride. And so the theories began. The first and most common was simple. The driver had lost control, either through exhaustion or intent. Some argued that his disappearance after the incident was evidence of guilt, that he had driven the bus off its normal route deliberately, leading the children into the forest with unknown purpose. His silence during the trip, his refusal to answer questions, his cryptic words, "We cannot turn back now," all fed into this possibility. There were whispers that he had been unstable, that his past held secrets the school ignored when hiring him, but this theory faltered when examined closely. Tire tracks led to a clearing that should not have been reachable by bus. Soil samples contained minerals not native to the region, and most damning of all, not a single road in the county matched the one the survivors described. If the driver was guilty, then he had led them onto a path that should not have existed. A second theory emerged from within the community itself, rooted in stories older than the school, older even than the town. Elders spoke of the land as a place marked, a space where settlers once refused to build because animals would not cross it, and compasses spun without reason. There were tales of disappearances dating back generations, hunters who never returned, travelers who vanished along forest roads, children who strayed too far and were found days later unable to speak of where they had been. Some believed the bus had simply stumbled into that place, drawn off its course by something that waited in silence. Survivors' descriptions of the trees leaning inward, of voices in the wind, of time stretching unnaturally. These echoed the old stories too precisely to ignore. This theory did not offer answers, only the suggestion that the land itself had swallowed the bus, as it had swallowed others before. Paranormal investigators who studied the case leaned heavily into this second explanation, though their interpretations varied. Some suggested the children and teachers had slipped into a kind of temporal distortion, a place outside ordinary time. They pointed to the frozen bus clock, the accounts of days passing when only hours had been recorded, the shared dreams that continued long after. Others claimed the incident bore hallmarks of what they called thin places, locations where the boundary between worlds is fragile. Theories ranged from portals to other dimensions, to the influence of entities that fed on fear. These ideas found no home in official reports, but within the town, they gained quiet acceptance. After all, what else could explain the footprints that matched no known species, the photographs with blurred shapes no one could name? A third theory, darker still, whispered through the community in hushed tones, that it had not been an accident at all, nor an act of madness by the driver, but something intentional, ritualistic. Some pointed to the driver's unusual calm, to his refusal to leave the bus, to the scratches beneath the vehicle that seemed almost carved rather than random. They spoke of secret gatherings in the woods, of old rites passed down quietly, of bargains struck with forces better left unnamed. According to this theory, the children had been meant as an offering. The bus itself had been guided not by maps or roads, but by design. If this was true, then the only question that remained was why the ritual had failed, why the children were returned rather than taken. The driver's disappearance became, in this telling, not evidence of guilt, but evidence of his own fate, claimed by whatever he had summoned. Each of these theories carries its own weight, its own unease. Yet none can fully explain the contradictions. If the driver was guilty, why were no remains of him ever found? If the land was cursed, why did it allow the children to leave? If it was ritual, why did it end with silence instead of finality? Investigations only deepened the uncertainty. Experts in geology, psychology, and law enforcement produced reports that contradicted one another. Some dismissed the photographs as artifacts of damaged film, yet others insisted the distortions bore patterns too deliberate to be random. Some argued the children's shared dreams were symptoms of trauma, yet others noted that such uniformity in nightmares is almost unheard of without a common source. The parents, desperate for closure, clung to whichever explanation felt least unbearable. Some chose to believe in mechanical failure. Though it explained little, others accepted the idea of cursed land, preferring mystery over the thought of human malice. A few, quietly and fearfully, leaned toward ritual, unwilling to voice it aloud but unable to shake the conviction that their children had been chosen. In the end, the theories became less about truth and more about survival, each family shaping the story into something they could live with, even if it left them awake at night. The town itself became divided. Officials pushed the narrative of driver error, eager to bury the story under the weight of bureaucracy. Locals resisted, pointing to every unexplained detail, every silence in the official reports as proof that more had happened. This divide created fractures in relationships, arguments whispered in church pews, suspicions that eroded the fragile bonds of community. And still, the bus itself remained. Retired, locked away in a storage lot, its windows clouded with dust, its yellow paint fading into rust. Investigators visited it more than once, searching for mechanical faults, for clues missed the first time. They found none, yet those who stood inside spoke of a feeling they could not shake, a heaviness in the air, a sense that they were being observed. Even decades later, the bus is rarely mentioned aloud, as though the mere memory of it can summon something unwanted. In the end, the theories are not answers. They are reflections of fear, attempts to explain the unexplainable. Each one leaves something missing, a silence at its center, and perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. That whatever happened on that field trip, it does not fit into the categories of reason. It resists explanation, resists closure. It lingers as if the road itself is still out there, waiting for another bus to take the wrong turn. Time has passed, yet the memory of that field trip refuses to fade. The town has changed. Children have grown into adults, parents into elders, but the story lives on in ways that are not entirely human. It lingers in the silence of late evenings, in the unease that stirs when a bus drives down a deserted road, in the nervous glance a teacher gives when the word field trip is mentioned. The incident has become more than a tragedy. It has become a shadow, woven into the identity of the place, carried quietly from one generation to the next. There are those who try to dismiss it. They call it exaggeration, the invention of frightened minds, a tale twisted into something grotesque by time and repetition. They argue that memory is unreliable, that trauma reshapes the past into horrors greater than what occurred. And yet, if that were true, why do the survivors still speak of it in broken voices, pausing as though something unseen listens to every word? Why do their eyes shift to the corners of the room, to the window, as if expecting to see a clearing that should not exist? For others, the story is proof of something larger, something that humankind has always known but refuses to admit, that our world is not as stable as we pretend, that beneath the surface of roads and buildings, beneath the certainty of routine, lies something older, darker, and unyielding. They believe the bus had crossed into that truth for a brief moment, and those inside glimpsed what most are spared. Whether it was another place, another presence, or something nameless, they had touched it, and it had touched them in return. The most unsettling aspect of this story is not the missing driver, not the footprints that led nowhere, not even the photographs with their blurred faces and impossible shapes. It is the silence that followed. Silence from officials, silence from teachers, silence from the community itself, as though by refusing to speak of it they could bury it. But silence does not erase. Silence only feeds what waits in the dark. Survivors grew into adults, some leaving the town behind, yet wherever they went the field trip followed. They carried it in their dreams, in the way they jumped at the sound of wind pressing against glass, in the way they hesitated before stepping onto any bus. There are rumors still whispered, of other buses that disappeared briefly, of travelers who lost hours on familiar roads, of children who claimed to see a yellow vehicle parked in the distance, its windows dark, its door closed. None of these stories have ever been confirmed, but they echo the same question. If the road opened once, could it open again? And if so, what is waiting there? The unanswered questions gnaw at those who dare to reflect on the case. Why did the children return when others in older stories never did? Why was the driver taken? Or did he walk willingly into whatever lingered in that clearing? Why did the photographs show what human eyes could not? Each question deepens the dread rather than relieving it. Each question suggests there is no final answer, no safety in reason. Only mystery and the weight of knowing that mystery can touch anyone, anywhere, even on the most ordinary of mornings. Perhaps the most haunting thought is this. What if it was not an isolated incident? What if roads like the one they traveled exist all around us, waiting for the right conditions, the right silence, the right collection of lives to pass over them? What if the sound of tires on asphalt is sometimes the beginning of something else entirely? We comfort ourselves with the idea that what happened was rare, unrepeatable, but the truth is we do not know, and maybe we never will. The survivors, now older, speak less and less of that day. Some refuse to acknowledge it at all, as though to name it is to invite it back. Others share fragments, never the whole, never enough to form a complete picture. But in their pauses, in the tremor of their voices, In the long silence that follows every mention, you can sense the same fear that once filled that bus, a fear that has never left them. The field trip remains a wound without closure, a story without ending. And perhaps that is why it still haunts. Because it reminds us that the line between safety and horror is thinner than we want to believe. Because it proves that even the brightest days can twist into darkness without warning. Because it leaves us with one truth we cannot escape: that sometimes the road does not lead back home. And so the story closes not with answers, but with a question. When you watch a bus full of children disappear around a bend, when you hear the low hum of its engine fading into distance, how can you ever be sure it will arrive where it was meant to go?